Welcome to the first ever Truth Seekers podcast featuring two longtime friends, Tom and Glenn, where the two of us will be genuinely responding to the most recent podcast, whether it's Joe Rogan, Sam Harris, and we will be responding with the aim of just having great conversation around a topic we love.
Awesome. And today we're going to specifically only be looking at one podcast. That's going to be the recent Joe Rogan Experience, actually number 1006, Jordan Peterson and Bret Weinstein. And we're just kind of going to go over what we thought about it in general. So what was your take on it, Tom?
Well, overall, it was an extremely useful conversation. And I thoroughly enjoyed it because Bret Weinstein winds up being a really good counterweight to Jordan Peterson, in the sense that Jordan Peterson, although very evolutionarily minded, can get into wisdom, into sort of thinking about ideas from religion that can get unscientific, it seems, at times, even though he would claim it's all congruent. Bret Weinstein's more of a cold-hearted evolutionary scientist type. So to hear the two of them agree on a lot of things and then clash on different things was very cool, and I'm impressed with Joe Rogan for having this type of thing where he's not even the one asking the questions. The two of them are just going at it. I thought that was pretty cool. What were your thoughts?
Yeah, it's actually really impressive how little Rogan says at all. I mean, Rogan sort of like steers the conversation at a couple points and actually has some like really good quotes, and that's it. I mean, he's maybe less than 10% of this podcast, which it can't be an easy thing, but I think it's probably because of how much he respects Peterson and Weinstein. But my overall opinion on the podcast was it was a very wavy kind of podcast. At times, especially in the middle of it, I wind up getting a little things get a little vague. I mean, we'll get into some of the specifics, but before you had actually listened to the podcast before I did, at least in its entirety. And it's funny because I had listened to maybe the first 45 minutes when you had already listened to all of it. And you mentioned to me, you're like, oh, I was really impressed with Weinstein on this one. And I had the exact opposite opinion for the first 45 minutes. I was like, wow, Peterson is just killing it these first 45 minutes. He's dropping knowledge. He's doing his thing, going against a lot of the like neo-Marxism things.
That's his thing. Yep.
Yeah, he absolutely kills that wheelhouse where he's just talking about like his explanation about how the postmodern world is all teaching kids about a power dynamic.
Yes.
And that everyone's thinking about the world that way as opposed to who's on top and who's not, and it's not really so much about earning anything. It's more about like this guy's on top, and if they're on top, it must be unjust, and it's all about power, and then how can we achieve power?
Right. Power, ethics.
So I was very impressed with that.
Rather than just ethics.
Exactly. And I would say that wound up being one of the main topics of the podcast, was them talking about power in the modern day and how it's thought about.
I know, yep. Exactly.
So that was I thought pretty clear.
So the first cluster, that first 45 minutes where they attack Marxism, basically together, but Peterson obviously can talk it out. And you mentioned the power dynamics element. Is there any area where you disagree with Peterson and find yourself standing up for the left-wing people when they're doing this pummeling? Or do you basically just always agree with the right-wingers? And I would note that this is a theme repeated on Joe Rogan by different speakers and or Peterson each time he comes, right? So what how are you thinking that through?
Well, I would actually say that there's, if we're talking about Rogan in general as a podcast and who he has on, there is a bit of diversity in how the left is viewed. He's always going to go against the crazy left, the hyper left. And he'll say, okay, they're wrong. And even whether there's a conservative or a more left-leaning person on the podcast, he will always say, okay, the extreme leftists are not good. But then I think it's the middle ground left is where you see Rogan kind of waver a little bit. So, yes, I wind up agreeing with Peterson and Weinstein when they're talking about the left, but they're not really talking about the general left for the most part.
Yep, I agree.
A lot of their scenarios are an extreme left. They're a very entrenched sort of bureaucratic system that's involved in their... Because they're both professors.
That's
so
the key
they're
thing.
Very entrenched in that.
And they
their world is a little
exactly.
different.
They deal with their philosopher class in general. Like,
Exactly.
you're thinking,
Which is as left as you can get.
Which is then you run into immediately Marxism. And Marxism has that funny way of seeming very ethical because it's focused on equity. But the problem is what's the best system overall for the most people over time? And that winds up being, well, if the rich people get there from corruption, I agree with you, Karl Marx. If the rich people get there in the same way Bill Gates, Jeff Bezos, Jack Ma got there, Mark Zuckerberg got there, there's a major item they contributed. And it's like, that's so overlooked. That's always so I'm always so on the right wing side because the left-wingers don't understand that business is good and government can be good, but it's limited. It's not positive sum. It doesn't grow on top of itself. Like, you need it to regulate. So, however, I would like them to focus on that a little bit more than the psychology of it all. It's like just the systems themselves. Like a group of businesses works, right? And nothing else can replace that. And that has to be private interest. So... it's just, I guess, on the margins, how we feel about that topic. But Marxism's scary because it sounds good because of the equity. That's the thing I took away from Peterson.
Yeah. I think even Weinstein, who probably even agrees a little more with some of those left-leaning ideas, agrees with the idea of the equity. Now, the thing that I think both of them draw the line on is equity doesn't necessarily equal fairness. And it doesn't necessarily equal merit, right? If everything is equal, that doesn't mean that things are fair. And this is where it's very sympathetic for people that align with that sort of thinking when they're like seeking out equality, because I think a lot of the times they treat equality and fairness as synonymous when they're not. Now, if we have a scenario where it's me and you, and we're both at a job, and we're paid the exact same amount, right? That's equity. Yep. Now, if you work twice as hard as I do, that's not fair. There's equity, but there's not fairness in that scenario. A lot of the times it seems like the equity idea implies a certain level of fairness, but it doesn't necessitate it, and that's what's so complicating to it all. And that's why the idea of equity could be very alluring, but it doesn't necessarily in the real world where people put in various amounts of effort and work. And Rogan touches on this later too. Rogan talks about how people should work hard and that over time people will work hard. There's this very specific point, I think either towards the middle or the end, where Weinstein is talking about all this power you get by being in a position or a high position. It might have actually even been Peterson that said this, but they were talking about the position that Rogan is in, having 1 billion downloads, so to speak. And then he gets access to all these better things, right? And it allows him to then grow easier and gain more and more steam. And Rogan actually pushed back on this idea, saying that, listen, if you also work hard over time and you hone your craft, you are going to start building momentum. So the issue of equity. Now, all these things defeat equity, right?
Yeah, I was going to exactly.
They're all saying, okay, Rogan, you shouldn't give up 85% of your views just for the sake of equity.
Of course. And that was effective.
But he does argue for fairness.
When Peterson said that part, that was effective. No, I agree. So that distribution he was talking about was very interesting, where the way that nature will play out is a small amount of human beings will accrue a huge amount of the gains, in part because they put in the hours and they're smart. And he says that at some point too, that's a mix to make a Mark Zuckerberg equivalent. And but ultimately those things are good for us in real life. Now, I get how big businesses, and Bret Weinstein brings this up. Big businesses can influence the government and be corrupt. We all agree that's bad. That's one area you can definitely agree. And maybe the right wing is too lenient on business to some extent because it may use government as corruption, but we basically agree that's bad. Then his other kind of counterpoint toward capitalism as well, I thought, was when he says around the point of it's a good system for making things, however, it can't ethically guide what to make. And did you grab that part as well? That's I believe toward the later end. I thought that was a good point. He was saying, listen, markets are a beautiful system, but they can make cigarettes, right? Or they can make apples, right? Depending on what the human being is. So I agreed with him there. I'm just, what's the next move? It's like, well, if it's enlightening the people, I agree with you. If it's regulation, I may or may not agree, right? So, but I thought that was effective. I really liked that point on against capitalism, which was it's not ethical, except that it reflects us, I guess.
Yeah, it's going to meet the demands of the people, but the demands of the people aren't necessarily always good, right?
Right.
Just because there's a profit to be made doesn't mean necessarily that the thing that's being profited off of is going to help society. Which, interestingly, so this is where that boils into another argument that this is probably the biggest part where Peterson and Weinstein disagreed. Is they disagreed over the nature of truth. Shocking that Peterson would disagree with somebody over the nature of truth after the Harris podcast debacle in some ways. They have this idea where Peterson talks about everything has to line up, and that even if something isn't factual, as long as it lines up in all these positive ways, it's going to be a good thing for people. And it seems like Weinstein doesn't quite necessarily agree with that. This was specifically in terms of in religion and its necessity. And so an example of this, specifically, Weinstein says the "thou shalt not enrich uranium" line.
What'd you think of that?
I thought that it sounds genius, but it doesn't necessarily discount what Peterson says. So let me explain that a little bit.
Yeah.
Weinstein says this: "Thou shalt not enrich uranium." Rule number one. And what he's saying, right, is like, okay, if you could base a religion or a set of ideas that would stop the creation of nuclear weapons, right? That's essentially what he's saying. Then that's rule number one, right? That's a great rule. Now, the interesting thing is, this doesn't actually disagree with Peterson as much as even Weinstein seems to posit it. If Peterson has the idea of like, okay, what's a good thing? Okay, let's say "thou shalt not kill," right? Well, if you extend that across your immediate family, and then your community, and then the world, that still actually takes care of his "thou shalt not enrich uranium" thing.
I agree. Yeah.
So
Thou shalt not kill
he gets a little too
covers
specific.
Yeah.
Exactly. So that, I think, is the irony, is that specifics sometimes don't cover it.
And I was really happy he used that porcupine example, and because
explain that a little bit.
Yes, so the porcupine example is that there is a saying amongst people in tribes that the porcupine can shoot its needles, and maybe you could say this amongst each other and to the children, so that way when they see a porcupine, because they believe that it can shoot its needles, they will keep a far amount of distance. And however, porcupines cannot shoot their needles. So this was an example of wisdom, because it could keep the youngsters away from porcupines because of that belief, while simultaneously being factually incorrect. And the reason I was happy he said this is because this is fundamentally not how I personally view wisdom, where it's factually incorrect, but it's like a useful lie. A useful lie reminds me a little bit of some of the critique of religion sometimes. It's like, okay, you're just going to believe something, and part of the argument is not that it's not true, but the argument is it just feels good to do it. And I don't like that type of thing. I like it to be more congruent. And this is where I thought Peterson's response was inadequate, right? And that Bret Weinstein showed with that example that he disagrees with what I believe truth is, in the wisdom sense. And the way to talk about wisdom is to basically, to me, think about a lot of how life is and the wisdom you learn, and you realize that it's not like the porcupine shoot their needles. And an example would be telling the truth. Telling the truth is a classic way where you may say, well, if I lie, I can get what I want. What's the benefit of truth? And the benefit of telling the truth is that your body witnesses you telling the truth, and then therefore you're almost feeding your subconscious mind the right information. And there are different wisdoms throughout life that are fascinating, and like when you let your guard down with people instead of trying to be someone you're not. You're right. There's all kinds of these, and those don't seem like, oh, that's the porcupine shooting the needles. Those seem pretty special. So I thought the whole conversation did not honor wisdom. That was my take on the whole situation.
Yeah, and Rogan actually pushed back a little bit on Weinstein there when he says, he's like, well, why can't you just tell the kids that no, those porcupines are dangerous, that the needles are sharp, but why do you have to lie to them? Why can't you just tell them that they're dangerous and they're sharp, and then the kids will stay away from them? So I think Weinstein was also just kind of using that as an example.
Yes, exactly.
Not necessarily that
I agree.
That all instances of wisdom are white lies.
Exactly. And when Peterson responded with the order and chaos as an idea of as a wisdom example, Weinstein basically said, yeah, not all of them are good though. Like, okay, yes, the Taoists got the yin yang right, or something like that, he's saying. But they're not all good. So maybe he was granting more sophisticated forms of wisdom. I just would have liked Peterson to use examples of it in motion to remind us what it is, right?
Yeah. Yeah, so this is where, obviously, you're a gigantic Peterson fan, so you're a little more well-versed in Peterson than I am.
Yes,
but
certainly. This
is where I think Peterson falls flat a little bit at a lot of points in this podcast, especially towards the middle, is he cannot talk in examples very well. Or at least in this instance doesn't talk in examples very well. He does a lot of this. The neo-Marxists believe that. The postmodernists believe this. And he talks in these very, very big generalities. And when he talks in those generalities, I find it very difficult to frame exactly how the things he's talking about would fit into my real world. He's always framing in sort of like a historical context or a philosophical context of, if you're a neo-Marxist, this is what you believe. It's like, okay, but what is a neo-Marxist? What is the average person here? Are we calling any left-leaning individual, a neo-Marxist? I mean, there needs
voters.
to be better definitions.
Probably not, right? Exactly.
Probably not. So that's where I think Weinstein picks up a lot of steam towards that middle point and on the podcast is he can relate things on a very specific level.
Yep.
Whereas Peterson winds up relating them on a sort of general, vague level.
You saw a lot of Peterson, Weinstein saying limited sentences, and then Peterson having to take up lots of time to inflate his argument up to Peterson, Weinstein's few sentences, right? Some of those times.
Yes.
So I thought that was fascinating in general. Yeah.
Yeah, it's a really interesting dynamic. I mean, the breakdown of this video, if I just had to say offhand, like, okay, what's the speaking relation here? It's probably 60% Peterson, 30% Weinstein, 10% Rogan, and the most memorable parts of it, other than that first half an hour, come from Weinstein and Rogan. They make these very concise, simple statements that are firm and you can understand them, whereas Peterson, like you said, speaks in this very grandiose way, and he always does this thing too where let's say we're at the topic, right? Let's say Weinstein or Rogan bring up a specific topic, like when they get to talking about Hitler. Very specific topic. And then the first thing Peterson does when addressing that topic is not address the topic. The first thing he does is take a step back and then provide a greater scope and then dive back into the topic.
Yeah,
and
very often.
It takes you out of the discussion very often because the more he talks about that greater topic, the less you remember what Weinstein just said. You're suddenly reacting then to
completely agree.
This stage that Peterson has set instead of what Weinstein just said.
Yeah, I completely agree. And I thought exactly the wisdom area as well was just like very few people do this where they just sort of ring off examples. I mean, you see actually politicians ring off bullet points, but in this situation, I would have liked him to remind us again of what is wisdom, right? So examples, telling the truth. The fact that contribution and working hard makes you happy and pleasure seeking doesn't, paradoxically, right? And then you have when you're with people having no agenda, to be creative, you have to be spontaneous, more like in sports when you have to relax. I mean, there's all these. It's kind of like psychology, except that it also affects everybody. So psychology is typically the one person at a time, but like wisdom is sort of like one person at a time, but then taking into account there are multiple human beings, that we all have our own views, and sometimes they do scary things when the wrong ideas take over. And that happens through time, which is another crazy thing, is the human beings behave like, Hitler had an ideology to go with it, right? And it's like, ooh, wow, okay. So spiritual realm and all that, like the Guy Ritchie, he says interior world and exterior world, there's basically only two. And basically, I think it's what he means is just, if the world of people on their insides. And that's what wisdom is about. So but I don't, Peterson doesn't really say it that sharp. And, Weinstein said some remark during it, like, the kind of truth that we all know is true, right? Real, just like condescending almost, like, we all know the porcupine doesn't shoot its needles. I was like, oh, Peterson, where are you on me right now? Like, you move into examples. That's the way to do it, but that's okay. He can't know everything because he's the researcher. That's the funny thing about Peterson. We can't expect him to be the proper marketer of all his ideas because the creator can't see through. He can't look at it, right? It's all in his head.
Not removed from it,
He's too connected to every node, right? So it's hard for him to simplify, which is why we need the internet to simplify it. So,
No, I agree. And that's the main argument that Weinstein was talking about here was ancestral wisdom. Yep. He's like, ancestral wisdom is powerful and great, but it's incomplete because it may not always be true. And that is where he winds up winning, if you want to view it that way, or winds up getting the final say on it to Peterson. because that is the point at which he launched into the thou shalt not enrich uranium thing. That was what kicked that off.
That was his
the
big attack.
ancestral wisdom is powerful,
but not updated.
But is incomplete.
Right.
Yeah, it's incomplete. And this is where I disagree with him. And I think you also kind of do. Is that the wisdom is not incomplete because it is so universal and because it is so general and applicable to everybody. It is powerful, and that's why it is all encompassing.
Right, exactly.
So
I completely
you don't need the facts.
Now I see your uranium thou shalt not kill point, right? Because you could see how, wait a second, it is in there. You just have to interpret thou shalt not kill with the nuclear bomb to get that. It's a derivative of these universal principles.
Exactly.
I know.
Exactly.
I know. And
yeah. The porcupine thing, to me, is not an example of ancestral wisdom. He was using a very isolated scenario.
Yep.
That's a specific instance, right? Yep. Would you ever tell your kids who are like, okay, can you give me some lessons for life? And you're like, well, the porcupines throw their needles.
Exactly.
No, you're going to go a lot vaguer than that. You're going to say, be kind to people. Try to understand people's frames of perspective. The golden rule, right? Golden rule is the perfect one, right? Yeah. Do unto others as you would have them do unto you. Right? That's ancestral wisdom. Tell me a scenario where that doesn't fit. Because that seems to encompass everything. That to me is true ancestral wisdom. Some passed down thing about a porcupine I would not call wisdom.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely.
Like, and that's where I think Peterson could have came back at him.
Absolutely. Like, there's forgiveness, which is always very interesting to me because forgiveness typically means someone wronged you. And rather than you continuing the energy flow by wronging them in reverse, which in some ways is just, it's like eye for an eye, right? But forgiveness is like you lost your eye and you're not going to take the other one's eye, right? And that is where you're like, man, that could change a civilization, right? That could change a civilization if embodied. So when you read that in the Bible, and then if you are focused on the wisdom that the Bible is talking about as like this universal wisdom, it's like, then it's awesome. And it's Weinstein, you're like,
but complicated,
right? Like,
because dude, you somehow just use two Bible things that are contradictory, right? The notion of forgiveness is, you would call that great wisdom, but then there's also the notion of an eye for an eye,
right? The Bible goes against that specifically. It sets it up and knocks it down with Jesus in the New Testament, I believe.
But you can argue that both of these things are ideas of ancestral wisdom. See, that is the complicated part about, and that's why it's brutal. I mean, look, the podcast was almost 3 hours long, and these two guys don't unfortunately get to be in a room with each other very often, so you can't really fully explore everything.
Yep.
And I get that a little bit, but even just blanketing everything under wisdom, it's like, it's hard because you could literally probably have a 10-hour dissertation or debate between a bunch of different parties saying what things should qualify as wisdom or not, and what should check off the boxes.
I really appreciate that point because so similarly how within fact there's false facts, eye for an eye may be not as true as forgiveness in this world. Now maybe that could get updated again. But if you ask the beings in that time period, like truth and lies, which environment would be better for your children if you practiced? Truth. Better. How better? They won't be alcoholics. They won't blah, 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 blah. So I do believe some things, the wisdom should be able to hold their own as their own metric, although some I would grant would be blurry.
Yeah, and this
but facts as well, though. Gravity is super true, right, in science, right? Very, very, very true. Whereas other things are less true. Climate change, right? Or pick something in the middle.
Or it depends how you, I guess you want to define that.
Exactly. Yeah. Pick something in the middle. So they're going to have their spectrum as well. The important thing is that wisdom is just looking at a different thing. It's looking at how the conscious beings behave, given we have some element of choice, so it seems. Whereas fact is not trying to do that. So why they always have to compete and one has to be on top of the other is always silly to me, because I feel like the two work together.
Well, here's how I'd say they intermingle.
Yeah.
And it's unfortunate because it got to kind of I think it did almost get touched on in the podcast. Very towards the end, where even Rogan, a half an hour before this, said, "Hey guys, we've been sitting here for 3 hours," like, so you knew the podcast was winding down. Peterson brings up Trump and his use of how he uses rhetoric and how he talks about things, and he brings up this idea of the white lie and the black truth. And what he's saying is there's some lies that can be beneficial, and there's some truths that can be detrimental. And I think those are the 4 categories that you can separate things into all of a sudden. As you could say, you have truths that are important and that are positive, and then you have truths that should be reserved for certain scenarios. So that would be the true truth, then the black truth.
Yep.
And then you'd have, on the other side of the spectrum, you'd have the white lie, which, while still a lie, could be a net positive for a scenario and have its own level of truthiness to it, or usefulness. And then you have the out-and-out lies that are bad and that really never have a standing. So if you separate those 4 things, and then you start applying that as a lens to how can you categorize statements at times and beliefs at times, then you can begin to sort out what wisdoms will be. Because like that porcupine thing would fall into a white lie, okay?
Yep.
Net useful, however factually untrue. And then you'd have also like the specific black truth that Peterson brought up was Trump's relation to there was violence on all sides, or there's bad people on all sides thing.
Yep.
And Peterson's point was, factually, this is true. There are negative people. Yeah. Exactly. And there was negative people and violence on both sides of the political spectrum. Peterson's point, though, was that in this instance, that truth is not useful. So if you begin applying things like that, where you can see how, okay, this is where things can be filtered into, and this is where we can begin putting these nuggets of wisdom. Now, I would then classify your forgiveness, let's say, right? Mm-hmm. Forgiveness. Where does forgiveness fall on? Okay, this is true in every scenario. This is your perfect truth. In that forgiveness is an eternal wisdom. There's no scenario where forgiveness is bad. There's no scenario where it doesn't work and doesn't become a net positive for the individual involved in it.
It's like,
so then you can begin sorting things.
Exactly. And it's like, I'm sure there could be a situation that could be imagined in which the right thing to do is not forgive. It's a great question, because forgiveness is ultimately an internal... it should be explicitized. Like, you want to forgive your parents or what have you, you should say it out loud. However, it is an internal thing, yeah.
Yeah, no, and of course, I'm thinking of a topic where it wouldn't work. It's like, okay, somebody commits murder, you forgive them, so you release them, and they commit murder again. It's like, okay, well, that's maybe not a good use of forgiveness.
So the one that I want to take on is telling the truth, ironically. Like, being honest, let's say. That's the act of telling the truth. So when you're judging that, the way to judge honesty is not whether or not the person's fact was correct, but it's whether or not they sincerely attempted to use their best knowledge and they're not deceiving you specifically. So, ironically, right there, to me, telling the truth is similar to forgiveness. Now, here's the thing, though. You can lie to the Nazi guards when Anne Frank is in your attic, right? We all agree. So
Well, you would
that
call that a white lie then in that scenario, right?
you would, for the sake, because you would, if you're at the door and you said that, and then someone asked you about it, you could say, number one, I know that I lied, but it was the right thing to do, and I would agree. It doesn't. Some people want to use that to take down telling the truth, but in situations that doesn't have to be, telling the truth is then your best option, right? Now, so it's just like, for some people want to use that example to undo telling the truth, I feel like, sometimes.
Yeah.
And I don't believe that that's fair, because part of using wisdom is being sincere to that moment in time and doing what you have to do then. And sometimes it may not be the right thing, unfortunately, although some principles you don't want to break. So it's pretty interesting.
Well, I think you said the perfect word, honesty. There's a difference, I would say, between honesty and truth.
Definitely.
Honesty is understanding the scenario and saying the truest thing within that scenario. Whereas truths are these kind of, it's like the point also Rogan brings up is like, why are we calling it truth? Why can't we just delineate the difference between truth and fact? Like, is it the truth that the porcupine throws its quills? No. But it is a truth in the way that it is dangerous. However, it is a fact that they don't throw their quills. So it's like, then honesty is, if somebody asks you, why are we afraid of the porcupines? Why do we not go by them? The honest answer is, listen, they don't throw their quills, but they are still dangerous. That would be honesty.
You could say it's as if they threw their quills. That's how dangerous they are. They don't throw their quills, though, right?
They do not.
Exactly. So
that would be a
that's a good white truth. I agree with that. So and the way to be honest and use the porcupine thing effectively is to change the language to it's as if, but maybe folks didn't always have that in their repertoire of language, so they just said it throws needles, right?
Well, I think there's also a gap in knowledge. Is maybe at some point they thought they did throw their quills, right? Like, you get hit by a porcupine the very first time, you don't know what's going on, you freak out, you go back to your village and you're like, it threw the quills at me. So then everyone becomes afraid of the porcupines, they stay away from them, and that's kind of right. That's how myths and legends get built, right? Is there's a kernel of truth that gets expanded on,
or not a kernel, but it's not true in fact, but it is true in phenomena. It's like
that's where the word truth gets
right. Like, you have the god of whichever the god of anger is. Like, oh, you have the god of blah 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 in you, and it's like that's half true, because it's as if I do, right? And that's what I mean when I say that. However, we have them all mixed up in modern culture, right? Because we interpret across these two back and forth. I like that Peterson had the model fact versus wisdom on deck, so he at least didn't repeat the Sam Harris thing. He said, yes, you could say fact versus wisdom. I almost wanted to applaud him, like, hooray, we got it. Okay, truth is the top, and then you can break it into two, and our world is some interplay. The problem was just the lack of defense of, they steel-manned science and possibly not wisdom, because his basic defense was the field analogy, which was a field doesn't tell you how to run up it. Instead, you bring some kind of ethic of how you're going to run up the field to optimize it. So it's a clash.
Yeah,
it's true. The problem is it doesn't quite get the audience on the same page.
Incomplete.
Like when he uses Atlas and says, young men, if you're having pleasure seeking as your main thing instead of work seeking, it's no surprise you're unhappy. And like, everyone knows that they need to hear that. It's like, oh, okay, that's a wisdom.
Okay, so here's an interesting departure from this.
Please.
And to talk even about the podcast as a whole, right? So let's say you've never seen Peterson or Weinstein. Would you say this is a good representation? If you want someone to get their first exposure to Peterson and Weinstein, is this even the best instance of each of them on Rogan?
I would definitely say no. I would say instead this is more of a good advanced conversation, where if you've been studying Weinstein and Peterson, I came away with a lot of gems. Like, yeah, you got to hear Peterson defend wisdom, and he uses a field analogy and so forth. Or I got to hear someone defend Marxism from this perspective of, oh, Marx has good critiques for capitalism, and capitalism doesn't has an ethic. So like there were some cool takeaways from both parties. And to see Peterson not have an epic performance like he typically does was also very funny, right? Because Peterson typically, you're like, oh my God, I have to keep pausing it and just taking notes. And this time was a little more...
He drops knowledge, yeah.
Yeah, exactly. So, and I love the format in general, but I would agree. It wouldn't necessarily be one I would send as a first couple. And how about
you? I would agree.
Well?
Especially in relation to Peterson's second performance on Rogan.
Oh, of course.
The second Peterson on Rogan, it's like if you're not familiar with Jordan Peterson, you want to listen to a nice, understanded, good, solid conversation, and you already like Joe Rogan, listen to the second Peterson on Rogan. Yep. This is not his best showing. That one is spectacular.
Yep.
Weinstein, I think you do get a...
He didn't have enough time to talk.
Unfortunately.
Yeah.
Exactly. But when he does speak, it is strong.
Oh, man. I rank him highly. And for him to be this... like I know he said on Rogan previously, I'm a deeply progressive guy. And I see it out of him. I see it because if you're scientific... One of the fundamental questions is, like, is there a natural order to life, right? Or can we make it ourselves is sort of one of the... And religious people seem to have the view that God makes an order. And even though I disagree with them on their God, I agree that there's kind of an order already. Whereas I'm not sure what Weinstein believes exactly about that. Because he doesn't seem to take... He seems to think the ancient wisdoms are kind of weak and that we could basically write a better one tomorrow. And when I know the people that I know today versus, like... the proper interpretation of The Prodigal Son by Guy Ritchie, right? It's like, oh, forgive your animalistic side.
Yeah, the metaphorical.
Right, you're like, oh, that's so good. Right, that's better than a lot of things I'm hearing. So it's like, I agree with Weinstein theoretically, but in my real life, it's just very funny swerving in and out of agreement with him, you know? But I would have liked more time for him to talk because he had a lot of things to say quickly that were very impactful and kept Peterson flustered, which was cool.
Yeah, no, I agree that if I had to say, like, you know, where would I rank this podcast, like among all podcasts, among all of them, yeah, like it's still a 9 because what they're talking about is so meaty
and
but
relevant. I know.
Yeah, like exactly. In relation to its potential, it's like a 7. It's like a 6 or a 7. Because there was a lot that could have been delved into. Even that idea that you just said right there of Weinstein being against, or at least devaluing maybe, metaphorical wisdom as opposed to factual wisdom. It never really got addressed. It kind of got passed over to some degree.
Yeah.
And that's an argument where you know how Peterson's opinions on religion and at the very least Christianity or Judeo-Christianity and the way he favors it and believes it can be useful in life. And obviously you see the skepticism coming from Weinstein. There's a lot to be had in... okay, how can we unpack these lessons, and are they still useful, and how incomplete are they really? Are they as incomplete as Weinstein is saying, and thus making them dangerous? Or is there still so much positivity that they are useful? That, to me, would have been an excellent conversation for the two of them to have, where they clearly have opposing views.
Yep, I completely agree.
So that's the only... bit that I would say was a little bit.
They can just run it back. Exactly. They can run it back.
The hope is that they will.
Exactly.
It worked obviously for Harris and Peterson. Multiple bites at the apple kind of helps because these guys, we're getting in an era too where the world, or at least this world of knowledge and thought is crossing over a lot. So Peterson knows who Weinstein is before they meet, and vice versa.
Absolutely.
And they all kind of know each other without meeting each other. So the first time they meet, it's always going to be this like, it's like you've got this like pen pal or this person that you've just been dying to meet, and then you finally meet them and like you just vomit up everything. You just say everything. It's too much going on. You got too much energy. And at times it was a little like that. It's like you hope second meeting, if and when it happens, that you'll get a much more calmed down, orderly conversation. But
yeah,
like I said, this is still worth checking out, at the very least worth perusing.
I was gonna say, and perhaps a point to end on is just the significance of what the internet and what YouTube and what podcasts are doing right now. By typically you read books, right? And that's the key way. Now you can watch videos, listen to podcasts, and then some of the people that you're listening to are live and they're still creating new content. And that's pretty cool. But then when the platforms have them intersect, which very few do, and if all goes well, we will have the opportunity to host multiple parties with differing interests, and together, it was great to see the two of them have each other to counter each other, which was really cool. And you actually see new knowledge can be formed, and we can groom each other's ideas live now. So that is pretty cool. The authors are live and debating each other on platforms for long hours of time with millions of people listening, and not an not a bad interruptive commentator and there's no commercials. It's like, oh, very nice. So that's really cool. Very exciting. So
yeah, and that definitely has a lot of crossover with what we're trying to do here, and what we hope to keep doing with future podcasts is highlighting these things.
Absolutely.
Highlighting these moments where you get these great crossovers, and even if they're imperfect, and I'm sure a lot of the times they will be, they're so much better than the average thing. And I think that's a great point you made about this living, breathing nature of it. It's like these are two guys that are still around, that thoughts are evolving, that situations are evolving, and they're commenting on the world around them. And that world is not just around them, it's around us. Like, that is as many great speeches as we've all loved from previous historical figures. They're not as much talking about the world that we live in today. They're obviously stuck in their moment in history. But Weinstein, Peterson, Rogan, Rubin, Harris, all the guys we listen to, Carlin, they're in our world. They're living, breathing in our world, talking about our world. And that is why listening to these conversations may be the most useful thing you can do. I really wouldn't rank, if you're going to spend your time listening to people commenting on your modern world, I would rank this above any news show, anything, because these are the people that are going to help you understand the world around you in a very real way. Not just with the facts, ironically, but with actual wisdoms.
Yep. Agreed.
So let's
wrap it up here.
I think it's fair to call it here, yeah.